Oh, that's sorry. I am not Anne Maloney. Our speaker will be here shortly. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. It's great to see so many students who have turned out for this public lecture, this Mind and Heart lecture. My name is Andrew Willett, and I am the director of the Office of Campus Ministry for Holy Cross College, and I want to warmly welcome our students, faculty, and staff here for this lecture, as well as guests from the college as well. Guests from the tri-campus community and the local South Bend community. It really is wonderful for us to be here. The Mind and Heart lecture series began a few years ago with generous alumni benefactors who have helped make this possible. Some of the speakers we've had in the past included John Allen from Crux, Ph.D. Selenia, theologian out from California, and Dr. Scott Hahn. And now we're very happy to invite Dr. Anne Maloney up here to give her lecture on the sexual revolution and its impact on women. Please consider any questions you might have for the talk. There will be some time for Q&A after Dr. Maloney's lecture. And then hopefully you brought your appetite too, because we have a splendid reception of food and drink in the Vincent Atrium that everyone is invited to after the lecture. So I'm here to open us up in prayer, and I will pass the microphone off to Dr. Michael Griffin. So let us bow our heads in prayer in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. God, our Heavenly Father, we ask that you be with our Holy Cross College family, that we might be strengthened in our efforts to pray, to learn, and to heal. We ask that you continue to be with us in this academic year, that we might continue to grow in the education of the mind and the heart, and to learn how to be scholars, citizens, leaders, and disciples. May your Holy Spirit be with us in this lecture, and we pray that your Holy Spirit guide Dr. Maloney's talk, that you may guide the beginning of her work, direct its progress, and bring it to completion. And we make this prayer through the intercession of Our Lady as we pray, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Saint Andre Bessette, Blessed Basil Moreau, Ave Crux. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. At this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Michael Griffin, our Provost and Senior Vice President, up, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Andrew. And in addition to welcoming Dr. Maloney tonight, we also welcome her husband, Stephen, here from Minnesota, both of them, and we had a delightful dinner with them and also some of our Holy Cross saints. And it was very edifying to hear Doctors Maloney comment on our student body here and the level of interest in the life of the mind and the life of the church. And to hear it said by outsiders that we have something special here at Holy Cross College, and all of you are part of that. And that is something to really treasure, especially on a night like tonight when we can engage some of these deep questions where the life of the mind and the life of our culture intersect. Dr. Anne Maloney received her Ph.D. in philosophy from Marquette University in 1988. And currently, she is an associate professor of philosophy at St. Catherine's University in St. Paul, Minnesota. Her area of specialization includes the philosophy of women, ethics, philosophy and literature, philosophy of religion, and existentialism. She has published articles in Crisis Magazine, Human Life Review, and in the Journal of Pro-Life Feminism. Also, she has contributed chapters to 2 books dealing with abortion and social ethics, titled Living with Contradictions, Controversies in Feminist Social Ethics, and the second book, Catholicism and Abortion, A New Generation of Catholic Response. She is also the co-author of the book, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, Mothers, Sons, and Leadership. Dr. Maloney has appeared on CNN and on National Public Radio, and has spoken often in the Twin Cities and around the country about ethics, feminism, abortion, contraception, Marriage and Sexuality. With her husband Stephen, who is also a philosopher, they have 3 children and 2 grandchildren. On this special evening of this very distinguished lecture, help me in giving a Holy Cross welcome to Dr. Anne Maloney.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. I feel like I walked into my own week. Or maybe there'll be more cheers then. I hope. Anyway, yes, I spent the entire day here, and I just can't say enough about this wonderful campus and these amazing professors. I've met some students, I've met some deans, and I'm ready to pack my bags and come on. But I think my students would have something to say about that. Anyway, I'm really glad to be here tonight. I'm really glad to talk to you about this. When I first spoke to the people here about coming and giving this talk, I said, well, what would you be interested in me talking about? And they said, well, how about the sexual revolution? And I said, that is actually an area of interest for me. And I teach a course in philosophy and women. I'm teaching it this semester, as a matter of fact. And the things that have come up for me as a scholar and as a Catholic and as a human being in the course of teaching these courses has just been an amazing journey for me. So I wanted to share some of that with you. The name of my talk is You Say You Want a Revolution, and I'm totally dating myself because that's a Beatles song, for those of you who don't know. But it's actually the title of my talk because the next line of the song is, well, we all want to change the world. Well, I think that feminism did want to change the world, but I think the world changed in ways that feminism isn't quite knowing how to grapple with or account for. So I was looking at this poem by Philip Larkin, who was at one point the poet laureate of England. He wrote a poem about the sexual revolution. Now, he's more like my age and less like many of your age. So he actually lived through the sexual revolution that was going on while he was in college. And so he says in this poem called Annus Mirabilis, sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, between the end of the Chatterley Band and the Beatles' first LP. Up to then, there'd only been a sort of bargaining, a wrangle for the ring, a shame that started at 16 and spread to everything. Then all at once the quarrel sank. Everyone felt the same, and every life became a brilliant breaking of the bank, a quite unlosable game. So life was never better than in 1963, though just too late for me, between the end of the Chatterley Band, the band, and the Beatles' first LP. So, apparently, given the date here, 1963, Philip Larkin thought that the sexual revolution started with the distribution in America of the birth control pill. And he's not alone in that regard. Neither is he alone in the conclusion that the pill brought the end of shame and the dawning of a quite unlosable game, although all that fun came, sadly, he says, too late for him. Now, anyone who wants to do so can Google the history of the sexual revolution, and we can all read about the impact of the pill, of the Supreme Court's 1966 Griswold versus Connecticut decision that unmarried people could purchase birth control, or Roe versus Wade, or even the publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Those are all interesting moments in cultural history. However, I'm not an historian, cultural or otherwise, and the people who invited me here tonight know that. They know that I'm not here to give a history talk. I'm a philosopher. And as a philosopher, I want to talk a bit about the thinking that delivered the sexual revolution to us. My primary goal tonight is to consider the relationship between the sexual revolution and the evolution of Western thinking about the relationship between the body and the soul. In doing this, I hope to do several things. First, I'm hoping to critique, briefly, the dualist vision of body-soul as offered to us by the Enlightenment by examining the liberal feminism of John Stuart Mill. Next, I want to turn to Marxist philosophy's materialist treatment of the body-soul dynamic, focusing especially on dialectical materialism. My examination of Marxist principles will include the argument made by Marxist feminists that Marx didn't go far enough in claiming that nothing was natural. I'm going to outline liberal and Marxist thinking, and I hope it's not going to be as deadly as that just sounded, because I will argue that contemporary culture is a Frankensteinian melange of both, which is the major cause of our sexual confusion in 2020. We are a society that is willing to claim, with dualism, that our bodies are really nothing, while at the same time agreeing with materialism that our bodies are really everything. I will then look briefly at contemporary sexual culture and point out examples of this rampant sexual confusion using information gleaned from my students and students at other universities. I will then conclude by imagining a way out of our current sexual chaos by turning away from both dualism and materialism and instead embracing Hypomorphism as the sanest and truest way to envision the human person. So let's get started. I'm going to talk just a little bit about liberal feminism. In 1869, liberal thinker John Stuart Mill rocked the Western world with the publication of an essay called On the Subjection of Women. His groundbreaking essay applied the core beliefs of liberal theory to the status of women, including such core values as equal rights under the law. The right to vote, to work, and to own property, Mill argued, arise out of our status as rational creatures, and women are, after all, rational. It's wonderful that John Stuart Mill recognized women as beings with minds. But in basing equality and rights on the possession of minds, Mill and his liberal friends overlooked the body, considering it accidental and non-essential to the definition of the human person. This is something that Alison Jager later called normative dualism. This embrace of dualism in the Western intellectual world began with René Descartes, who set forth mind as constitutive of the human person. Unlike Plato's dualism, in which the soul does bring life to the body and so is connected to the body, Descartes' dualism severed that relationship entirely. Descartes took this position because of his starting point, which is that the most fundamental thing I know is the content of my own mind. From this point, he had to argue to the existence of body and of the world, a connection that is never explained. Descartes set the stage for the sort of dualism which gripped the Western world in ways that are still apparent. Once Descartes argued that the body has no important relationship to the mind, that it is a machine, albeit a complex one, modern philosophers were left with three choices. They could accept dualism, but be unable to connect body and mind. Otherwise, they could choose one part over the other. They could opt either for mind or for matter. In other words, philosophers who were unwilling to accept a dualism which is incoherent at its foundation had to choose to claim either that mind can explain body, which is idealism, or that body can explain mind, which is materialism. The stunning scientific advances of the modern era, not to mention common sense, mitigated against idealism in favor of materialism. And materialist philosophers are right to say that bodies matter. Yes, reason is an important part of the definition of the human person, and women, rational beings that we are human too. But liberal theory's willingness to overlook embodiment resulted in a false and sometimes dangerous vision of human beings as minds, who are free to treat their bodies as non-essential, easy to control, and disposable. Not only that, but claiming that men and women are equal because bodily differences don't matter actually results in the assumption that the generic human person is a creature who looks, thinks, and talks like a male. The move away from dualism was justifiable, but when large numbers of scientists and philosophers turned from dualism to materialism, nothing got better. Dualism argued that the nature of a human being is to be rational, the body isn't important. There are, as we noted, problems with that claim, but at least dualists believed there was such a thing as human nature. Not so materialism. For a materialist, human nature is a descriptive phrase without content. What philosophers have traditionally called human nature is the result of a complex interaction of biology and environment. And that leads us to Marxist materialism. Marxist materialism continues to be extremely influential in academic and intellectual circles. Marx argues that just as human biology has resulted in the development of certain social structures, so too have certain social structures resulted in the development of the facts of human biology. For example, the hand is not only the organ of labor, it is also the product of that labor. That's Karl Engels. No doubt, according to this view, some early prehistoric ancestors of ours had an accidental growth or arrangement of digits that gave them a greater ability to manipulate tools. This ability gave them a physical advantage which allowed them to get their genes into the next generation. Generation after generation, this initially accidental difference became more pronounced as tool use itself became more regular and sophisticated. Thus, the fact that human beings have hands is not in any real sense natural, according to Marxism. Rather, it is the result of a complex interaction of biology and culture. In other words, as digits become pronounced, tools were used more often and more ably. Dialectically, as tools were used more often and more ably, digits became more defined and pronounced through the generations. This was my prop. The Marxist view is that what we have traditionally called the human person is precisely such a complex interaction of biology and culture. Many contemporary feminist philosophers embrace Marx and fault him only for not carrying his insight far enough. If the hand is socially constructed, that is the result of biology plus environment, they say, well then so is the womb. Marx failed, they claim, to extend the vision properly beyond hands to the domestic division of labor in the home. Alison Jaeger speaks for a whole lot of contemporary academic feminism when she says, and this is a quote, "The conclusion is not simply that human biology and the forms of social life are more cultural and less natural than biological determinists suppose. It is rather that, where human nature is concerned, there is no line between nature and culture. In other words, my body is everything. There is no soul, no immaterial mind. Everything is material. The only real thing about the human being is her matter. The body is everything. And the body is plastic and malleable. It is socially constructed by power dynamics in society. Men have power, and so women have wombs. It's mistaken to claim that women naturally lactate or that men naturally grow facial hair. Natural is a word without a referent. What we call natural is, in fact, socially constructed, according to these contemporary academic feminists. Just as a farmer in Iowa might breed chickens to produce more white meat, women have been bred to do the dirty work of reproducing the patriarchy. Since there is no such thing as nature or the natural, these feminists argue strenuously that no social unit is truly any more natural than any other. Since everything is socially constructed, right down to the level of human biology itself, certainly human social organization is socially constructed. Some of the practical outcomes of this belief are, as Alison Jaeger puts it, and this is another quote, no social activity or form of social organization is any more natural than any other. Male dominance is no more nor less natural than female dominance. It is not more nor less natural for mothers to rear children than for fathers to rear children. Heterosexual intercourse is not more or less natural than other forms of sexual activity. Giving birth in the field is not more or less natural than giving birth in a hospital or even providing an ovum for a test tube baby. And that's the end of the quote. We have managed to become a culture in which people believe that the body is everything, Marxist materialism, and yet also that the body is nothing, dualism. Sometimes the same person believes both things, and certainly the culture as a whole acts as if it does. I'm reminded sometimes of George Orwell's book, 1984, which defined doublethink as, quote, the power of holding two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them. Our culture today swings between these two philosophies, seemingly unaware of the impossibility that both could be true. Women and men treat their bodies as tools of their reason, appendages that can be manipulated and controlled at will with no negative consequences to their minds and hearts. If I have a body that gets pregnant, there's a fix for that. If I have a body that gets pregnant despite my best efforts, there's a fix for that too. If I use my body as a personal whoopee cushion and have sex with anyone who looks plausible, well, it's just my body. It's not my mind. It's not my soul. There's no soul. Philip Larkin, in his poem, imagines the wonder and joy of disconnecting sex from procreation. What fun! What pleasure! And yet it isn't 1963 anymore. It's 2020. Well, now it's 2021. I wrote the date down wrong. And an awful lot of people aren't having any fun. In fact, people are miserable. The two most prescribed medications at the University of Minnesota in 2020, which was the last time I checked, are the birth control pill and antidepressants. What happened? And that leads me to the third part of my talk, where we are today. Where I am is I teach philosophy, and I have done so for over 30 years at St. Catherine University. St. Kate's is a wonderful place to be for anyone who wants a real strong sense for how it's all going in terms of the whole my body is nothing but my body is everything philosophy. Not well. The young women I encounter often can't name what has gone wrong in their lives, but they know that something has gone terribly wrong. Last semester, I taught a course called Philosophy and Film. In the first part of the course, we examined marriage through the lens of what Harvard philosopher Stanley Cavell calls the Comedies of Remarriage, the Hollywood film from the 1930s and 1940s, such as The Awful Truth, Bringing Up Baby, and It Happened One Night. Cavell points out that these films portray women and men as good for each other. They teach each other, they learn from each other, and they have some grand laughs. In the second part of the course that I teach, things get a bit grimmer. Here we examine what Cavell calls the melodrama of the unknown woman. And in these films, the male is far from a benign presence in a woman's life. Indeed, he is a malignant influence, destroying the woman either deliberately, as in a movie like Gaslight, or with brutal indifference, discarding her after having had sex with her, Letter from an Unknown Woman. In our discussion last term of Letter from an Unknown Woman, my students could barely contain their contempt for the female lead, Lisa. How could she be so stupid? Why was she so self-sacrificing? Why did everything have to be about him? Why didn't she have any self-respect? But I'd seen this response the year before when I taught philosophy and film, and so I was prepared. I handed out and read with them in class an article written by a student in 2020 at Middlebury College. This was not Joan Fontaine letting herself be victimized by Louis Jourdan in 1942. This essay had been written by a peer, a woman named Leah Fessler. I'm just going to read a few brief excerpts from this essay because I think it's informative. So here's what she said. At Middlebury College, I lived a double life. On the surface, I was successful. I was surrounded by diverse intellectual friends. I led a popular student website and was active in the arts and athletics. I loved learning and made Phi Beta Kappa my junior year. I'm also a white, straight, cisgendered female. If you're thinking, please, your privileged ass has nothing to complain about, you're right. But my internal life was characterized by paralyzing anxiety and depression. I judged myself harshly to the point of disgust. I drove myself to excessive exercising and near anorexia. I felt this way because of men, or so I thought. While there was a major gulf between my public self and my private one, the one thing that remained consistent were my politics. I told myself that I was a feminist, despite subjecting myself to unfulfilling, emotionally damaging sexual experiences, and I believed it too. I soon came to believe that real relationships were impossible at Middlebury. I convinced myself I didn't want one anyway. It wasn't just the social pressure that drove me to buy into the commitment-free hookup lifestyle, but my own identity as a feminist. The winter of my junior year, I asked Ben, a quiet, smart philosophy major with bright blue eyes, to a wine and cheese party. We saw each other for a few months. On weekends, I'd text him around 10 p.m., usually somewhat drunk. We'd meet in one of our dorm rooms, debate philosophy and Fleet Foxes lyrics, talk about our families and aspirations, and then have sex. Give or take some weeknight Netflix watching or walks in town, I cycled through this routine with at least 5 guys by junior year. When Don fell asleep, I'd pretend to doze off as well. During the night, I'd pull the covers or brush his toes, craving an arm around my waist. I'd analyze snippets of our conversation. Sometimes I'd leave an earring on his bedside table when I left, before he woke up, a reason to come back. With time, inevitably, came attachment. And with attachment came shame, anxiety, and emptiness. My girlfriends and I were top students, scientists, artists, and leaders. We could advocate for anything except our own bodies. We won accolades from our professors, but the men we were sleeping with wouldn't even eat breakfast with us the next morning. We were desperate to know what it felt like to be wanted, desperate for a chance at intimacy. I wished that I could be like the guys who seemed not to care at all. Months after things had ended between us, Ben said, I didn't think of you as a human being while we were hooking up. If this was sexual liberation, it was hard to understand how it was helping women. Most Middlebury women were playing the game, yet almost none of us enjoyed it. Then this author says, I went on to publish my thoughts online, and stories from students around the country came pouring in. It was clear that we were far from alone. The truth is that for many women, there's nothing liberating about emotionless, non-committal sex. The young women I spoke with were taking part in hookup culture because they thought that's what guys wanted, or because they hoped a casual encounter would be a stepping stone to commitment. I've realized that sex is inextricably linked to emotions, trust, curiosity, and above all, self-awareness. To attempt to separate emotions from sex is not only illogical, given that emotion intensely augments pleasure, but also impossible for many women. When I finished reading Miss Fessler's piece in class with my students, there was dead silence. Well, I said, why so quiet? What are you all thinking? One of my students blurted, I feel totally called out. Meaning what? I asked. Meaning I've done this stuff, and this is how I feel too. I just never admitted it. There was a tsunami of assent after that student spoke. I think every student talked. They were awake, they were aware, they were mad. And I knew this, because I've been around for a while. St. Kate's is a women's college. Here are some things over the years my students have told me. These are from my students, these are just stories. This weekend I went to my first college party and I hit it off with a guy, so we went into the back bedroom where the coats were and started kissing, but then he reached down, moved my panties aside and penetrated me, so I guess I'm not a virgin anymore. Another young woman came to me to explain some absences. She was in tears. She'd been diagnosed with genital warts, and her doctor told her that she may have trouble conceiving children in the future. She had always, she told me, assumed she would get married and have a family someday. And the worst part is, she wailed in my office, I'm not even promiscuous. I've only had sex with 8 guys. Once in a writing assignment about Socrates in the Allegory of the Cave, a student wrote that she decided to make better choices after she woke up one morning in a trailer covered with scratches, naked, next to a man she didn't remember meeting. A 17-year-old student in a class discussion said that her boyfriend, with whom she's sexually active, wanted to slap her during sex, but she took a stand and said no. Another student wrote in an in-class writing that she had lost her virginity to her boyfriend and she felt terrible, but she was sure that was just cultural guilt. She was an international student. And it was probably an empowering experience, but she just didn't feel that way yet. Also, her boyfriend has been standoffish ever since, which worries her. Women have never been more sexually liberated than these women are, or so they are told. No more are they shackled by ridiculous bonds like commandments, moral rules, words like chastity. We're free, they shout. Why are we so miserable? They whisper. One woman went to her health center because she feared she had bronchitis. In perusing her health history, the physician said, I see here that you are a virgin. Yes, she responded, wondering what that fact might have to do with her persistent cough. Would you like to be referred for counseling about that? This student wondered if she should in fact consider her virginity a psychological handicap. Once the culture embraced non-marital sex and made it the norm, women who don't want to have casual sex often feel like outcasts, even weirdos. This is an actual letter written to Dear Abby. I first saw it in a collection of essays by Walker Percy, and I hunted it down, being the good student I am, to make sure that it wasn't Dear Abby, and it wasn't Dear Abby. So this is the letter that someone wrote to Dear Abby. Dear Abby, I am a 23-year-old liberated woman who has been on the pill for 2 years. It's getting pretty expensive, and I think my boyfriend should share half the cost, but I don't know him well enough yet to discuss money. If you want to look it up, it's The Best of Dear Abby, Andrews and McNeil, 1981. I teach an occasional seminar in philosophy and addiction where we read about what the experience of addiction teaches us about embodiment. One of the books that we discuss is Caroline Kapp's book called Drinking a Love Story. The students adore this book, and we have great conversations in class. The chapter that generates by far the most passion is the one on drinking and sex. Knapp speaks honestly about the key role that alcohol played in her decisions to have sex, sex that she regretted because it made her feel terrible. My students love Knapp's book, and just as in the philosophy and film class, are gratified to have something powerful named for them. Knapp says that despite her freedom to drink as much as she wanted and have as much sex as she wanted, she never felt free. My students get that. I'm going to go out on a limb here and suggest that the reason that so many college-age women binge drink is so they can bear their own closeted sorrow about what they're doing. So St. Kate's is a women's college, and so I have limited contact with young men. I know enough, I think, however, to know that none of this is good for the men either. Have any of us tuned in lately, paid attention to the lives of our young men these days? You know, men, like out here I can see everywhere, men between the ages of 20 and 30. How are you doing? I'm wondering if maybe the answer is not so well. When women demanded of men a high degree of commitment and responsibility before engaging in sex with them, men tended to get married and stay married. They got jobs, real jobs that could support a family. Living in their parents' basement until they found themselves wasn't that much of an option, and guess what? They were happier. Increasing numbers of young men are showing up at 12-step meetings admitting an addiction to pornography. The insidious ease with which men can access pornography, coupled with a culture that encourages its men to treat women as objects for their use, has men in its thrall. More and more men are finding it too hard to meet and spend time with actual human women with flaws and quirks and imperfections. The women they can encounter in porn are always sexually alluring, always eager for them, and always interested in whatever perverse activity they can dream up. Men know on some level they're in dangerous territory. They know what emptiness feels like. So the world we've created for these young people is a world which welcomes every kind of sexual behavior except chastity. Anal sex? Okay. Threesomes? Sure. Sex upon first meeting you? Yeah. Virginity till marriage? What the hell is wrong with you? These young women are wounded, and almost no one is helping them to look for the source of the bleeding. The women who hook up feel awful and have no idea why. It's hard to heal when you don't know how or where you've been damaged. And the despair and shame that these women feel, I think, is real. I think the young women and men of today are living in a chaotic culture that has embraced my body is nothing, that mentality of liberal thinking, and yet also my body is everything, that mentality of materialist thinking. No wonder we're in a mess. Well, as much as it may not seem this way, I'm not really here just to scream about all the doom and gloom of the sexual revolution. I'm actually hoping I have a solution. And that solution is hypomorphism. Hypomorphism comes from the Greek words hule, which means material, and morphe, which means form. Aristotle argued that the substantial form of the human is the intellectus soul. It is by means of the intellectus soul that we experience an intellectual way of existing in the world as embodied creatures. Our intellectual soul permits us to think about absolute principles and act as responsible agents. It allows us to know not simply that things are, but on an even deeper level, what things are. It gives us the ability to paint and build houses, to fall in love, to do science. Dualism asserts the preeminence of mind over and against the body and the brain. Materialism says that all we are is the brain. We are complex organisms. Hypomorphism says no to both dualism and materialism. To the dualist, the hylomorphist says that my body and my soul are not separable except through death. Our bodies and our souls are grown together, forming a concrete whole that has powers and capacities greater than the sum of our parts. Dualists got something right. Our substantial forms, our souls, possess a type of freedom from the body as we persist through time. But dualists also got a big something wrong. In fact, our material component, our bodies, are absolutely essential to our substances. They're the very reason for being. The reason for our form to be is to inform some matter. Materialists got something right. Materiality is important and the matter of our bodies is essential. But materialism got something wrong. The real presence of personal subjectivity experienced by each person can be accounted for only if there is an intellectual soul. In other words, there is something about us that is properly transcendent, non-reducible, and subjective. We are able to reach beyond the material constituency of our corporeality in a non-physical, spiritual way, especially when we come to know anything. When we say I, our experience is that there is truly an I to speak of, something in every human person that is the center of our human personal activity. All of its activities, powers, and capabilities are themselves non-material, yet they do require, at least in part, to be embodied as well. Hylomorphism explains things that materialism can't explain. When a doctor studying epileptic patients observed brain surgeries, these are the Penfield experiments for any of those who are familiar with them, he noticed something huge. The patients were anesthetized but awake because the surgeons needed to keep them talking to make certain they weren't cutting any of the wrong lines. When the surgeon situated behind the patient's vision field probed a certain part of the brain, the patient's arm would go up. The patient would see that happen and say, I didn't do that. When asked to raise his arm, the patient would do so. On the brain scans, those two actions of raising his arm were physically identical actions. But on one of them, the patient said with certainty, I didn't do that. Hypomorphism accounts for that non-physical but quite real I. On the other side, hypomorphism accounts for the reality, for example, that rape is devastating. No woman who was ever raped ever responds with, oh well, that wasn't me, that was just my body. She knows it was her body, and it certainly was her. Hypomorphism accounts for that quite real experience of ourselves as bodily. A strong theoretical case can be made for the truth of hypomorphism. Human experience verifies that hypomorphism is true and that my body is not something that I have and use. It is part and parcel of who I am. I'm not a spirit using this flesh. I am this flesh. For example, when I give a talk, I do not think a thought and then use a gesture. I simply think, and out of that thinking comes gestures. When our children used to cry out in the night, I didn't awaken and issue orders to my feet to move. I was halfway across the room before I even realized I was moving. When contemporary culture tells us that our bodies are nothing, it's telling us that we're free to engage in any sexual activity for pleasure. Sex will mean whatever we want it to mean. If we want it to mean commitment, marriage, family, it can mean that. If we want it to mean, hello, I would like to experience a good feeling with you and probably never see you again, it can mean that. I, meaning my mind, decide what sex means. But remember Leah from Middlebury College. Even when she tried really, really hard to have meaningless sex, she struggled. Why? I think Aristotle would say because Leah isn't a mind in a box. She's an embodied spirit. Dualists denigrate the body, but that's just as wrong, says the hypomorphist. To do as materialists do and denigrate the soul. We're not pure spirit, but we're not merely animals. We can understand a lot about ourselves as physical creatures by examining rats, but we are not, in fact, sophisticated rats. Think about Leah again. According to materialism, Leah is a complex organism, but she is an organism. Does she behave like an organism, though? Now, some of the people who I had lunch with today are huge fans of Walker Percy, and what I'm about to say, I totally got from Walker Percy. So if you had lunch with me, you already heard this at lunch, and you already knew it before I said it. Does Leah behave like an organism? Why do other organisms, let's just say animals, why do they have sex? I once asked this of a student, and she said, well, I don't know. I haven't ever observed post-coital animals. But I'm going to say that we know enough about it to pretty much be sure they're doing it to feel good. And when the act is completed, the animal is satisfied. Now, human beings also have sex. But we don't do it like animals do it. We often light candles, put on soft music, dim the lights, get dressed up, whisper words of love. We do all those kinds of things. Now, we also know in our heads that there's a connection between this good feeling and procreation. So all of that being aside, when an animal has good sex, what you have on your hands is a happy animal. But human beings, and take it from me, I've been in the trenches with my students, can often have physically good sex and feel awful. And when you look at that and you say, well, now why is that from, say, a hypomorphic point of view? It's because what human beings go to sex for is different. Because we're animals, but we're different. Human beings go for a sense of connection, love, union, creativity. And they can have a physically great experience, but if that's not there, they're not going to feel very good. So that example, that one example of sex illustrates the larger truth. Animals have bodies, we have bodies, but we just don't have bodies in the same way animals do. We do so many things animals don't do, like this. Can you imagine if there were, instead of you guys, puppies in these chairs, how long would I have kept their attention? I mean, unless I waved some raw meat, in which case I would also lose their attention because then they would all go for the meat because they would know what their best interest, where their best interests lie. But, I mean, building Holy Cross College, building cathedrals, designing bridges, being Shakespeare, writing poetry. I mean, let's face it, if the animals are doing this, they are superior beings because they're hiding really well. maybe not. We have cathedrals, we tell jokes, we get anxiety. Our souls can do things that matter cannot do, abstract and understand. And a faculty that operates in an immaterial fashion is not itself material. We are embodied spiritual beings. Both are essential. Enlightenment thinking doesn't get embodiment. Materialist thinking doesn't get the soul. We need a philosophy that gives proper weight to both body and soul. And I found that in Hypomorphism. So I'm going to conclude here, but let's think just for a minute about the sexual revolution. What does all of this say about the sexual revolution? Well, our bodies are philosophically and spiritually important. Sometimes people will say, for example, oh, you're a Catholic. Oh, Catholics, they think bodies are dirty. No, Catholicism thinks bodies are sacred. And those are really different. What I do with my body, I do with my very self. And God willed us to be embodied in the way that we are. And the fact is that women and men, when they're sexually intimate, pregnancy can happen. Historically, women have been careful about sex because of that natural fact. For most of human history, sex has been linked to babies and the creation of families. The implications of sex have, until very recently, been life-changing and sometimes lifelong. Now, of course, contemporary culture has embraced both contraception and abortion because, well, why not? My body is nothing. It's something I use and control and manipulate. What of it? At the same time, my body is everything. It's all that I am. And what I do with my body has no eternal consequence. I have no soul. Life is temporary. Death is final. Seize the gusto. Grab it and run. And, I mean, at least where I am in my part of the world, the whole idea that sex is somehow connected to the creation of families has begun to seem startling and foreign to a lot of people. They become so used to thinking of sex as something outside the realm of procreation that it shocks them to imagine that there was a time when they were firmly linked, when the culture had like actual public expectations around sex and marriage. I'll never forget one time I was teaching an ethics class, and we were doing Thomas Aquinas and the natural law. And I was trying to distinguish for them what Thomas meant by unintended and intended consequences. And so Thomas distinguishes between unintended consequences that are naturally connected to the act, like pregnancy, and unintended consequences that are not naturally part of the act, like a sexually transmitted disease. My students simply could not get their minds around how those were different. They just couldn't do it. In their minds, pregnancy, unwelcome outcome. STD, unwelcome outcome. What's the difference here? And so that connection between marriage and family has been so obscured in our culture because now we can use our reason to manipulate our bodies in ways that suit our purposes, or so we think. And we can justify the sexual activity that really comes about when we say, I'm free of all that, religious claptrap about immortal souls. The thing is that if Thomas Aquinas is right, and I think he is, the connection between sex and family is part of the natural law. And if you're Thomas Aquinas, that means it's written in our hearts. Now, I've raised 3 children. I'm a grandmother now, but I still remember I couldn't wait to buy my daughter Caitlin her first Barbie. I was a big Barbie fan. And so I probably bought her first Barbie when she was about 4 years old for Christmas. She opened it up and she said, "Oh, it's a mom. Where's the dad?" I was like, "What, Dad? No. I mean, Barbie, fashions, shoes, a Barbie camper. What are you getting about this?" And she's just like, "Well, where's the dad?" So I was like, fine. Luckily, her birthday is January 13th. So for a birthday present, I went out and I procured for her a Kenda. So now I think, great. So she opens it, "Oh, Mommy, Dad, where's the baby?" It's like, you don't understand Barbie at all. So what I basically said was, well, I think we have to buy Barbie a wedding dress. Which was, for her, that was great. Another outfit for Barbie. So Thomas Aquinas realized that Hypomorphism is in fact the theological underpinning of the truth expressed in Genesis, that we were created in the image and likeness of God. We weren't created to image God only through our souls. I mean, isn't that what made the devil so mad in Paradise Lost? He couldn't believe God was creating something that wasn't an angel and pure spirit. It had these disgusting animal-like bodies. No, we weren't created to image God only through our souls. Our bodies also reveal who we are as persons. Above all else, our bodies reveal us as being made for each other. The Trinity is an active relationship of self-forgetting love between persons. And when we are in those we image God in our activities of self-giving love, and our bodies tell us how to do that. Leon Kass has this beautiful article about Genesis. He's a Jewish philosopher, but he read Genesis very closely as a philosopher. And one of the things he says is that it strikes him that in the creation story, everyone always says, well, Adam was first and then Eve. But he says, but the creature was first. There was a creature made of dust and matter. But he didn't know he was male until he saw her. It was only when he saw the woman that he understood that he was male. He understood who he was through that otherness. And so, I mean, Cass's point is that the woman is epistemologically first, if ontologically second. Anyway, we are made in the image and likeness of God. And God willed us for our own sake, out of love. We image God when we will the other for his own sake, out of love. Not because of what he can do for us, but for what he is. So in the poem I started with, Philip Larkin imagined that before the glorious day when we could separate sex from all of this nonsense and treat our bodies like the fun tool they are, sex was a grim wrangle for the ring, causing shame that started at 16 and spread to everything. Larkin felt that the brave new world, a world without religious stricture because we no longer believe in things like immortal souls, would be a great world indeed, that every life would become a brilliant breaking of the bank, a quite unlosable game. Well, he was right about some things. Sex is certainly not about the wrangle for the ring anymore. When I got married in 1987, and that was a really long time ago, I get it. People were visibly shocked when I told them my mother told me not to marry my future husband until we were capable of supporting a family. Why on earth would she say that? Was the typical response. The answer was pretty simple. She thought that marriage, the wrangle for the ring, existed because sex makes babies. But as for Larkin's claim that the result of our culture's disastrous coupling of dualism and materialism when it comes to sex, well, it has turned out that that coupling has turned out to be, apparently, a losable game. And there are a lot of losses. And on that grim note, I must end my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maloney. I think we have some time for Q&A, so maybe if anyone has a question, a comment, whether it's amongst faculty, staff, especially our students too, I can run the microphone over to you. So let's see if there's any questions. Mikey, you got a question?
Yeah, going to the whole thing. You know how there's a lack of marriages going around in the 21st century, as there's a lack of people getting married in general because, you know, of the whole pornography and also too, the whole general culture. People are now centered around, like, I think money, because, you know, whoever has money, they don't look at personality qualities to any religious ideology. They're like, or if that person does not have money, then he or she is worthless. Yeah. And also too, the whole gender confusion thing, like, you know, sex changes, reinforces your point. It basically makes it as only the mind matters, or like the body is just like a tool, like a cybernetic robot type of thing you can interchangeably and having no mind. It might as well be like all in its mind, so it'd be like clones of like going to like one factory, or having the mindless creatures. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I don't know why exactly, but your question reminded me of something that just happened in class, in a different class that I teach. We were reading The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that book, but it's really a wonderful little book that kind of tells you how not to live your life. And we were talking about it, and one of the things I do when I teach that book is I say, okay, Ivan made a lot of mistakes. What is one mistake that Ivan made that you think you will never make? And what is one mistake that Ivan made that you think, geez, if I'm not careful, I could make that mistake? He had shallow friends. He didn't marry for the right reasons. He never had a relationship with his children. He only cared about his job because it gave him status and power. And he died a broken, empty, horrifying man. And so when I got all their input, because I had them all write that down, about 90% of my students said the mistake that they would never make is that they would never marry the wrong person. And so I said, well, now that's very interesting. Why do you all think that? And they said, because we don't even have to get married at all if we don't want to. That was an expectation from your generation, you know. And if we do get married for some reason and then things aren't working out, we'll just get divorced. And so I said, well, now, why do you think that that will be better than what happened to Ivan? Well, because he was unhappy because he married the wrong person. And that's not going to be a problem for us. And I said, so is what you're saying to me that you are the happiest of generations? And that, you know, things are just really like there's no anxiety and there's no, and they're like, oh. You know? And the fact of the matter is that a lot of them are kind of miserable because their parents are not only divorced, but ugly divorced. I mean, like, really tearing these kids apart. And so they're suddenly thinking, well, no, I'm not very happy. And so it was a really interesting conversation. But for some reason, what you said reminded me of that, because it was that whole question of, well, how much fun are we really having? You know? And so if we're having this attitude of treating the body, as you said, like a cyborg, and treating the body as a tool that we have and use, and not treating our body as something that we actually are and will be for all eternity, there are consequences to that. And some of them are pretty, you know, grim. I don't know if I spoke to your question at all, but it was very interesting. Well, yes. And I have to say that when I announced to my mother that I was engaged to marry a fellow philosopher, it was a dark moment for my mother. I mean, and then, you know, he still, because I got a job at St. Kate's, and he came with me, and he ended up working at some other places, and then he did get a job at St. Thomas, which is a college right down the street. So it worked out perfectly, but there were some stressful times in there, and I was pregnant for some of that. And, you know, my mother was worried about me. But when I was planning to walk down the aisle to marry him, neither of us had our PhDs yet, and I had a job. I was coming to St. Kate's, but he didn't have a job yet. And so I was imagining my wedding, and I said, Mom, when I'm walking down the aisle on Dad's arm, and what will you be thinking? You know, because I wanted this emotional Gilmore Girls moment. And my mother said, I'll be thinking of all my friends in the pew, thinking to themselves, I can't believe Mercedes Maloney let her daughter marry a man with no job. And I was like, wow, okay. But actually, I went to my philosophy mentor to ask what to do. I was so upset by this. Like, what should I do? What if he doesn't have a job? And my philosophy mentor said, I think you got to marry a man. You know, he could have a great job and be hit by a bus the next day. And I thought, well, he's right. So I did. It worked out good.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Yeah, any other questions? I might have a question. Is that okay? Can I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely.
Great. So you mentioned Walker Percy. I was one of the people at the lunch table that was talking about Walker Percy. But Walker Percy will use his own terms for this this polarization of the body and the spirit. He's going to talk about angelism and bestialism or bestialism. So bestialism is that, or bestialism is that emphasis of the body at the expense of the mind, and vice versa is angelism. So we've talked a lot about what Percy would call bestialism.
Yes.
I'm wondering maybe if you have any thoughts on the plague of angelism for our younger generation of men and women.
I sure do, I think, I hope. One of the books that Walker Percy wrote is actually a self-help book that he calls the last great self-help book you'll ever need. And it's really a hoot. So if you're looking for something that's kind of funny and strange and wonderful, Lost in the Cosmos is the book for you. But, I mean, in this book, he talks about the fact that most people don't understand that every single one of us is a unique, amazing, irreplaceable individual. And we go to for all of our answers, we tend to, because of the culture we live in, we go to science. And science, by its very definition, is about universals and abstraction and generalizations. But what we want from life is not just general knowledge We want to know what is true for us. Person was very affected by the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. And Soren Kierkegaard was the philosopher who said he studied Hegel and he was not impressed. And he said, I don't want to know what's true. I want to know what's true for me. And then he said, I want to know the truth for which I must live and die. You're never going to find that. I mean, this is why Walker Percy hated self-help books. Because what a self-help book does is it takes a unique, irreplaceable individual and tries to treat their problem, because you're reading a self-help book, you have a problem, as if it's a general category. The example I sometimes think of in class is when I was pregnant with my son, he flunked a couple, he's very brilliant now, but he flunked a couple of prenatal tests. And I was very worried about whether he had, I contracted chickenpox while I was pregnant, and there was some risk that the varicella virus had crossed the placenta and he would be born with a lot of problems. And so when we first heard this terrible news, I told my husband to drop me off at St. Kate's on the way home from the doctor, and I went into the library and I took out every nursing textbook they have, and I put them on the floor and I read all night. And then I came home, and then I said to my husband the next day, after class I'm going to go to the library and read some more. And he very wisely said, what you're looking for isn't in any of those books. You want to know if our baby's going to be okay. What I could find out in the book is, people in your situation have a 1 in 240 chance of conceiving a child with problems. That's not what I wanted. I didn't want to know about how I was like other professors or other white people or other women or other, I wanted to know, was I going to be okay? And science cannot give us that, but we go to it for that over and over and over again. We read self-help books, we look at studies, we try. I once had in a class, I assigned the class to write a paper about why do innocent people suffer. And one of the papers I got back was a sociological study of child abuse patterns. And I was like, that's not the why I was after here. And that, that's what I love about philosophy, but that need to understand who we are as the individuals we are. Science can't give us that. And the angelism in us is the part of us that wants to be not a person, but a category. Something I can fit on a grid. Something I can plot. And that is the thing. That's why every time a woman opens a woman's magazine and says, 12, I don't even read women's magazine anymore. You open up on the internet and somebody's trying to get you to click something that says 12 ways to lose 5 pounds by next month. I'm in. Well, you know what? Everyone is different. They're never going to find the answers in that kind of a broad, general scientific approach. Science is fantastic. Walker Percy was a scientist, but he knew what it couldn't do. And he felt like a lot of scientists didn't. And angelism is that over-reliance on myself as pure mind, and not my unique, irreplaceable self. I don't know if that answered your question.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Maloney, first of all, for coming. So I guess that's kind of like a chicken and egg question.
Yeah.
Like, where do you think this all came from? Because it seems to me that men tend to take advantage of women's promiscuity, but also women are promiscuous because they think it's what men want.
Yeah.
So kind of, where does that come from? And then also, how do you break that cycle?
Yeah. I'm a boy. Yeah. I wish I knew. I'd read a book. It's a really good question. And it is a chicken and egg question. And, automatically, I tend to go back to Genesis in terms of why is it this way. Because I think that while we're made in the image and likeness of God, we're different. Women and men are different. And we're different in ways that matter. And one of the reasons that I think the original couple was male and female is that when these particular differences are brought together in this particular way, amazing things happen. Yes, babies are made, but other amazing things happen. I think that women and men are different in ways that we actually need each other. It's like I sometimes say to students, imagine that you're in a room and half the room speaks French and the other half of the room speaks Italian, and you both have to be bilingual in a month. What are you going to do? You're going to find someone and learn that language. And so I think that women and men have different strengths and different weaknesses, and I think we balance each other out. Now, Leon Kass, the Jewish philosopher I mentioned earlier, takes embodiment very seriously. And he talks at length in one of his studies of Genesis about the fact, I mean, he actually says, he argues that the woman was the first person to be tempted by Satan, not because she was weak-willed, but because she was thinking about truth and beauty and goodness. And of course, the devil comes to us through our intellect and our pride, not our sexual. So, I mean, she was thinking about all truth and beauty and goodness because she could think about things like that, this is Cass, because the first man was just really thinking about sex. Because in order, I mean, it's not right. The Jewish faith, the baby always takes the faith of its mother, because the Jewish tradition is you always know if it's your child, if you're the mother, but you're only taking it on faith if you're the father. And so, I mean, there's a very hard-headed attitude about that in the Jewish tradition. But his feeling was, given the fact that no man can be 100% sure he's the father of his children, he has to, sow his seed far and wide. But the woman who has a huge investment in pregnancy and childbirth has to really kind of nurture this and not let that happen. And so there's this yin and yang between men and women. But what happens is that when men and women come together, they balance each other out in that way. The man now has the guarantee, and all feminists in my head are now screaming about how horrible this all is, but the man has the guarantee that these are his children because his wife has made vows of fidelity and permanence, and he promises to be true only to her, and she gives birth to and raises his children. So once we broke that kind of connection that everyone assumed always had to at least implicitly be the case when it came to heterosexual intercourse, well, I mean, now sex isn't related to that necessarily or even ever. And so it sort of untrammeled that sort of male desire to be sexually interested in a lot that's going on, a lot of the time. I mean, this always reminds me when I was in high school, and I asked Sister Rosaria, because someone had told me in my own life in high school that a boy would have an impure thought every 30 seconds. And Sister Rosaria had to be 90 years old. I don't know why I chose her, but I did. Maybe because I thought she was a straight shooter. But I said, Sister Rosaria, someone told me this. Is this true? And she said, no, dear, it's much more often than that. Well, I thought if Sister Rosaria knows, this must be the real deal. But so that was balanced out. And I think that once that was taken out of the equation, anything could go, and anything started to go. And I don't think men are fulfilled by that either. I think we've got a lot of really seriously hurting young men. And we've got seriously hurting young women. So I think it was that. And I think that why we have so many conversations now about what I call sexual chaos, because I see a lot of chaos in my students. I'm teaching a course this semester where some of my students are biologically male, but very much experience themselves as women. And I have students who are biologically female who very much experience themselves as men. I'm teaching a course called Philosophy in Women, and it's a real free-for-all, let me tell you, because I'm not even sure we all agree that there is such a thing. But the point is that they're having these experiences, and they're having all of this. I mean, I've got a student in there, I don't know why one day they all decided they had to declare this, but I've got someone who's pansexual, and someone who's asexual, and someone who's polysexual, and it's a lot going on here, right? But once you say that sex isn't a thing that creates families, then sex can be anything. And, I mean, that can be very confusing.
Were you satisfied with that answer, Elizabeth? Okay, great. Awesome.
Or are you just saying that so this can be over?
Folks, I thought that was a great note to end on, too. What we're going to do is I just have a couple announcements, and then if you want to follow further with Dr. Maloney, we have Anne, if you want to meet her lovely husband, Stephen, too, who's also a philosopher, you can chat with him at the reception. We have really good food at the reception, and it's free, and it's for you. So please come and eat the food. We haven't confirmed yet our speaker for the spring Mind and Heart lecture series, so I don't want to reveal it right now until it's totally confirmed. But I can tell you that we have another guest speaker coming out on February 24th. His name is Father Vincent Lambert of the Archdiocese of Indianapolis, and he is an exorcist for the Archdiocese of Indianapolis. So if you want to know if your friends are possessed by the devil, you should come on February 24th. Yes, I always joke that it's fascinating because I'll get someone to come out for Theology on Tap and talk about St. Francis, and I might get 50 people. I get someone to come to talk about Satan, and I might get 200 people. so I don't know why. But now with that, please give another round of applause to Dr. Maloney for a wonderful lecture, and we will see you in the Vincent Atrium for a nice reception. Thank you, everyone.